The giant snakehead, Southeast Asia's greatest freshwater target species, one of the funnest fighting fish out there, a fish that you can catch on multiple types of lures, and many times I've been asked by my fans, what kind of rod do I use when I fish for snakeheads? Well, today I want to give you guys some of my ideas for what works and what doesn't work for a snakehead rod and what I use in the reservoirs. So let's find out. So today I want to talk about the fishing rods I use to target these species, as well as attributes that I'm looking for in these rods to make my life easier when I'm out in the water. So first up, let's talk about rod length. It's a general rule of thumb that the longer your rod, the further your cast. I mean, my surf rod is 14 feet and casts things like crazy far. But the rods we're looking for snakehead fishing are a lot shorter than that. And we have to understand that the shorter the rod, the more accurate the cast, the longer the rod, the further the cast. The next thing we'll be talking about is the rod's action. The rod's action is where the rod bends when pressure is applied to it. A fast action rod bends closer to its tip when action is applied. That way, when you feel the fish bite, the slight bend in that rod is going to transfer that energy straight to your hands. Whereas a slower action or medium action rod, the rod will bend a much bigger U shape, more towards the middle, giving you that pressure much later. Then the next attribute we're looking for is the power of the rod. How much force is enough force to deal with these super fun and aggressive snakeheads? So first up, I'll tell you guys that I usually bring two rods when I go to the reservoirs to target the giant snakehead. The first one will be my sight casting rod. This one is used for mostly crankbaits, your jerk baits, anything that has a lip and ball bearings in it to give it that long casting distance. So these are lures that naturally get that distance already. You're not going to need the longest rod to cast them. With sight casting, what we're trying to do is we want to stand there and wait for an opportunity to cast at a rising snakehead. So snakeheads are fish that need to rise for air to breathe. And in that short time that they're on the surface, if you cast a lure at them at the right time, you can trigger a bite. But what that means is you want a rod that is both fast and very accurate. You don't want a rod that's way too long and takes you a big swing just to get your lure out there, and by the time it does, it goes too far or too close. The more important thing is you want to get the lure right there as soon as possible, as accurately as possible. So for me, I usually go for a 6 foot to 7 foot rod when it comes to casting my crankbaits. Then, when we're talking about the action of the rod, we are looking at crankbait action. So we don't want a fast action rod. We want like a more medium action rod. We want a rod that bends when you crank the lure back. Simply because when you're cranking back something like a Risto, any crankbait with a really long lip that dives down to 2 to 3 meters, you're going to experience a lot of water resistance. So as you're cranking it back, if you're doing this with a faster rod, the rod's is going to bend a little bit and you're going to take the brunt of that resistance in your wrist. You're not going to be able to do this all day on a fast action rod, so you're better off just going for medium action and cranking it back. And with the medium action, another benefit is that with the bend of this rod, it will allow it to take a bit of that pressure for when that fish bites and tries to shake the hook. Remember, we're fishing with crankbaits here, so most likely you'll be using something like treble hooks or smaller single hooks. And with these kind of setups, it's quite easy for the fish to shake the hook off if the rod is too stiff. So if you're using like a stiff, fast action rod with these crankbaits and these big snakeheads bite down on it and they got really hard bony mouths, so the moment they shake it, and if your rod's too stiff to give a little bit of that pressure away into the rod, then there's a likely chance that the fish would shake that hook off. So ideally you want to have a nice bend in your rod so when they do bite on something like a crankbait, they can shake themselves really aggressively underwater. They can even jump, and you could make sure that the power is dissipated into the bend of the rod, allowing you to not lose that fish. Now next up is the weight or the power of the rod. Now the weight and the power, usually you can find on the side of the rod written in either the line suggestion or the letters to the next of it. Now the letters, the ultralight L, UL, L, ML, these are usually up to the manufacturer. So there's no universal standard for what medium heavy actually is. So you gotta kind of go with your gut here. But generally speaking, when I'm fishing for snakeheads in the open water where there's no obstacles and I'm using a medium action rod, at most I would go with like a PE 2.5 rating kind of rod. So maybe a medium weight all the way to maybe a medium heavy if I know that I'm targeting the really big ones. So again, it's all up to where you're fishing and what you're targeting, especially if you're fry stocking. When you're fry stocking, you're going for the parent snakehead And these guys could be anywhere from 5 to 8 to 10 kilos. So if you are fry stocking, I suggest going up to the medium heavy weight, but with a medium action if you're fishing open water with a crankbait. So now we talked about my sight casting rod. Let's talk about the heavy action rod. The heavy action rod, I usually go for 7 to 7'4" in length. Now the reason why I want a slightly longer rod than the sight casting rod is because you're usually casting lures that have a lot of more wind resistance than a crankbait does. So with a crankbait, it's usually weighted very nicely, it cuts through the wind, and the only resistance you find is cranking it back. Well, in this case, we're talking about kicker frogs, buzz baits, propeller lures. These are lures that when you cast into the wind, they're just gonna lose their momentum, they're gonna hit that wind, they're not gonna be able to go as far. So ideally you want a rod that could get you the distance you want. You want to be able to cast the lure past the target point so that you can crank the lure back onto the target point where the fish will try to ambush you. And another thing is, when snakeheads chase your lure, one thing they do is sometimes they keep chasing and biting and chasing and biting. So if you can get a really nice long cast, you're giving the fish a lot more opportunity to chase your lure down before getting into your boat, seeing you, spooking out, and not wanting to bite. Now in terms of action, I always go with the fast, extra fast action. We're looking at snakeheads, fishing heavy cover here. So the more important thing is you don't want a rod that bends like the medium action rod. So you want a rod that stays relatively stiff, bending mostly at the tip. This way, one, the hook sets are much stronger. You don't want to have like a bendy rod when you're trying to set the hook on the fish, especially in heavy cover. In heavy cover fishing, the fish takes your lure, immediately tries to go down, tangle up with the weeds or the rocks or the trees and the branches. You don't want that. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that you can set that hook as soon as you feel pressure on that rod. With a medium action, it'll bend a lot more before you get the tension of the rod penetrated through the thick mouths of the snakehead. But in this case, we're using a fast, extra fast action, so when they do bite, you set that hook, you know it's going to go straight through. And another very important thing about using a fast action rod when fishing into heavy cover is your ability to guide the fish through obstacles. So you're going to be fighting fish through all sorts of things like branches, rocks, and whatnot when you're fishing into heavy cover spots. So in this case, you don't want a rod that bends too much because you want to be like, all right, fish is going right, I need to push it to the left, I need to pump it up, I need to move it away from an obstacle. With a fast action, your action from your wrist to the tip of the rod is a lot faster than a medium action. So you want that to control your fish. And thirdly, the reason why you want fast action is because topwater lures look a lot better with fast action rods. So things like walk the dog lures or, jerk lures that you can skip underneath the piers and all that kind of structure, you want a fast action rod. Next up, we're talking about the power and the weight of the rod. So yes, we have a fast action rod, but if you don't have the kind of strength to handle the snakehead fight, then you're going to snap the rod. Like if you have a fast action rod, but the weight is just too low, once you get that snakehead hooked on, guaranteed either your line will go first or your rod would definitely snap when you try to pull that snakehead out. You're looking at like a fish that could be anywhere from 2 to 7 kilos on average, and fighting in heavy cover means you must muscle this fish immediately out of the cover. So what I usually use for heavy cover is a medium heavy rod with a 10 to 20 pound line weight, or something like a PE 4 and above. You really want to muscle this fish out. So anything below that, you might just snap your rod or not have enough juice to pull it out. All right, so let's review the 2 rods that I bring to the reservoirs to go for snakehead. So the first one is my sight casting rod. You want to be able to cast the lure fast and accurately to take advantage of the rising snakeheads. So what you want is a 6'6" to 7 foot rod for that accuracy. Then you want a medium action because you're probably using crankbaits, so you want a rod that could bend enough to take the pressure off when you're cranking it back. And also you want it to take the pressure off when the fish bites and shakes his head so you don't lose your hook too easily. In terms of weight, you don't want to fish too heavy, but ideally you want a medium weight, maybe a medium heavy if you're targeting some of the bigger ones during the spawning season. Next up is our heavy cover snakehead rod. This one's a 7 foot to 7'3" with a fast action so that 1, we can hook this fish fast, 2, we could control it nicely, and 3, it has a better presentation for topwater lures. And finally, in terms of the weight for fighting the fish in a heavy cover, I suggest 10 to 20 pound line weight, a PE 4 and above, a medium heavy rod would be quite ideal. But if you're fishing from the shore, maybe you might go up a little more in terms of weight simply because you need to muscle that fish out of the water. Okay, that's all we have today about the rods I'd like to use for snakehead fishing in Thailand. Please let me know what you guys think. If you guys have any questions, please leave so in the comments below underneath the video. As for today, my name is OzBangkokhooker. Thank you for watching this to the end, and I'll see you next time for more snakehead videos and other fishing videos. สวัสดีครับ